Alright, so more on our old friends, the Presocratics. So, we just looked at Pythagoras, and we looked at Thales, and now we're going to look at Democritus. Okay, now here's what Democritus is thinking of. Seriously? Democritus. There's an I in there. These pens aren't exactly perfect for this sort of thing. But anyway, so Democritus. So here's the thing. Change carries with it a bit of a problem. Because for something to change, there has to be some sort of continuity. And what do we mean by continuity? Well, continuity is the idea that things stay the same. And here's what I mean. Take, if you will, a little seed, and then imagine the little seed, sprouting out. Okay, so here this line is dirt, okay? So there's one point in the thing, and then that little seed, turns into like a sapling, right? And then over time, that sapling turns into an adult tree, right? With roots and all that kind of stuff, okay? Then eventually, that tree, it's going to wither and begin to die, right? And eventually, it's going to, rot into the soil. Okay. So here's the thing. Now, let's give this tree a name. We'll call the tree Bob. This is Bob the tree. Okay. If one were to ask, what is Bob? One would have to really look at this whole line, right? Because this is as much Bob as is this, and this, and this, right? So all of these much different aspects are still part of Bob. Why? Well, because you can recognize, right? And it's probably even easier to consider when you think of people, right? Think of how you can recognize people from baby photographs and all that kind of stuff. So when Democritus is thinking about change, and change was a concept that was quite problematic to the ancient Greek Presocratics. And if you remember, change is the element of fire, right? Okay, that's supposed to be fire right there. But anyways, so the question then becomes this: if, let's take this little seed here. So this little seed weighs like maybe 1 ounce, right? Whereas this adult tree could weigh, 3 tons, right? So the deal is, this is tiny, this is big, but it's the same thing. And then this, right, if you've ever seen when a tree dies, it begins to decompose, right? And so it goes back into the soil. And so it becomes smaller and smaller pieces, right? So the question is, where does all this mass come from and where does it go? In other words, it's as if Bob is acquiring mass and then letting the mass go. And that, to Democritus, is quite a mystery. And so he postulates, well, how can it possibly be, that a thing can exist in such a way, right? So he thinks along something like this. Let's suppose this is a rock, okay? Here's a rock. We would concur that a rock could be divided, right? So we could break this sucker apart, and then we would have rock piece 1 and rock piece 2, right? And then we could break those apart, and then we could break those apart, and then we could break those apart, etc., right? So the idea is that if something is physical, right, it can be divided because it occupies space, right? So if something occupies space, it can be divided, and it can be divided into 2 physical pieces, right? Now, obviously, we would get to the point where it'd be so small that we would need magic tools, but theoretically, there's never a time when you divide the rock that it divides into nothing, right? Physical things cannot divide into nothing. Check? So if that's the case, we would have to conclude that everything physical can always be divided forever, right? So you have infinite divisibility. Does that make sense? But there's a problem with that. How do you spell divisibility? Seriously? Is it like that? Yeah. So think about this for a minute. If you could take this rock and divide it in half forever, the question becomes, how big is the rock, right? And the deal is, if it's going to be divided infinitely, so you never, ever, throughout eternity, get to a middle point, then when would you ever get to an end point? You wouldn't. Therefore, the rock would have to be infinite itself if it could be divided infinitely. Make sense? But here's the thing. We know that the rock is not infinite. How do I know? Well, because there are trees in the universe, and there are birds in the universe, and there are Brussels sprouts in the universe. Because if the rock were infinite, these things could not also exist because everything would be rock. Make sense? So what puzzles Democritus is, well, then how do you account for this idea, right? How do you account for the fact that physical things can be divided, but yet the contradiction is they're not infinite, right? So what he discovers is he says this. Okay, so this word in Greek essentially means cuttable. Okay, so there are some things in the universe that are cuttable. And he said physical things, however, cannot be cut infinitely. In other words, there has to be some things that are non-cuttable. In other words, sort of like baseline fundamental units that remain whole, right? Now, they remain whole and they cannot be cut. Now, in Greek, the way you say un or non is you put an a in front of a word. So, atombe means non-cuttable. And obviously in English, you get this word from atombe. So in other words, the word atom is non-cuttable. So in other words, the universe, according to Democritus, is made up of units which remain whole, which he calls atoms. And so physical things don't divide infinitely. They divide down to atoms, which are not cuttable. And then you can now make sense out of this scenario between the tree and the rotting log, right? Because you say, okay, if this is the seed, you say, well, atoms are, being collected, I guess you could say, by the tree, and then they are, arranged by forces of energy into this tree, and then eventually those same atoms lose whatever held them together, and they go back from which they came. But the idea is the units themselves constantly remain. The only thing that changes is the way that you organize or systematize those units. Anyway, that's the atomic theory. And that was Democritus, and he was writing probably about 500 BC or so, in that neighborhood. I'm not exactly sure of these dates. But anyways, and so that's the Presocratics. Now, there are a lot of other guys, obviously, that we could look at. The thing about the Presocratics, though, is there's not really a whole lot left of what they wrote, because a lot of it has been lost. And for the most part, we understand their philosophy as it was recorded by guys like Aristotle. In a lot of his works, he discusses what Presocratics had said. In other words, what the prevailing wisdom of the time was. And that's kind of the Presocratics. Now, let me look at the schedule here. The next thing we're going to get into is critical thinking and the Republic. So we're going to do two things. We're going to watch the movie Gladiator, right? And now, there are things online to help you out with that. Question sheets. It's not an assignment. It's just to help you, pick out the things I want. And then we're going to want to talk about it. Then we're going to start talking about the Republic. Now, the Republic is in your textbook, and the Republic is a dialogue. And it's not an easy read, but let me sort of tell you what's going on in there. You have two people. Actually, there's a couple, but a dialogue is always between two people. It's just that a couple guys come and go. But the two people who are speaking are Socrates and a guy named Euthyphro. Did I say the Republic? I'm sorry, I didn't mean the Republic. I meant the Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is trying to prosecute his father in a court. Now, Socrates is there because he is being prosecuted. Now, what's going on is they show up at the court. And the court is the Archon's office. So the Archon would be essentially the president kind of guy of Athens. And they hang out in his office because they are there for their trials. Okay. Now, the deal is this. This is the significance of all this stuff. The way trials were done in ancient Greece, and this is kind of significant for our understanding, is so you would have like a big amphitheater kind of thing, and these are all seats around here. And you could have, at these courts, sometimes up to 600 people. And here would be the kind of like, literally they were like theaters, eh? And you have, a guy on one side, and you have a guy on another side, and they take turns, and they go onto the stage, and they plead their case. Now, the idea was that it was largely about, so the way you won a case was by voting. So there's no jury. The jury would be these 600 people, and your guilt or innocence or whatever was based on voting. So you needed to get 51% of the people to agree with you. And the way to get these people to agree with you, because remember there's 600 of them, some of them back here are not going to be able to hear very well. And by the time Socrates is around, these jurors get paid to be there. So what happens is you get sort of like almost a mob of riffraff, you could say, in here. And these guys make decisions not based on their minds, but rather on emotion. Are they entertained? Now, you ask yourself, well, if you need to convince 51% of people, what is more convincing to them? Reason or emotion? That is, do we tend to like calm arguments that make logical sense, or do we tend to like things that are very interesting, entertaining, and give us an emotional charge? Obviously, it is this one. And so the secret to winning a trial is to be able to emotionally convince 51% of the people. And how do you do it? With entertaining stories. You entertain them. It's no different today, right? When you think of the sound bites and you look at news, shows like CNN and these sorts of things, it's geared to grab your attention and be spectacular and that sort of thing. And indeed, that's what's going on here in this trial. That's in the background. And I'm almost done, so I'm going to sign off. It's almost 15 minutes. And that's it, just these two for this portion.